The fluorescent light above the bathroom sink flickered and buzzed as I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shake off the exhaustion from 14 hours of driving through Texas heat. I had checked into this Motel 6 just outside of Amarillo around midnight, grateful to find a clean room with working air conditioning after hours of searching for available lodging along Interstate 40. The desk clerk had been friendly enough, handing me the key to room 127 with a tired smile and directions to the ice machine. But as I stood in that cramped bathroom, something in the mirror behind me made my blood freeze. For just a split second, I saw a face that wasn't mine reflected over my shoulder, pale and gaunt with hollow eyes that seemed to be staring directly at me. When I spun around, the bathroom was empty, just yellowed tiles and a shower curtain that hung motionless in the stale air. But I knew what I had seen. And I knew I wasn't alone in that room, despite having locked the door and checked every corner when I first entered. My name is Robert, and that night taught me that budget motels aren't just places where travelers rest their heads. They are repositories for the desperate, the displaced, and sometimes the dead who refuse to check out. Have you ever wondered why some motel rooms feel wrong the moment you step inside? Ever noticed how certain budget chains seem to attract more than their share of tragedy and desperation? Ring that notification bell if you've felt that creeping dread when you realize the previous occupant of your room might still be there. Because tonight I'm sharing 3 true accounts that will make you think twice about where you rest your head when you're far from home. These aren't exaggerated stories designed to scare budget travelers. These are real experiences from real people who learned that when you're staying in unfamiliar places, surrounded by strangers, and separated from home by hundreds of miles, even the most ordinary motel rooms can become stages for encounters that defy rational explanation. Jennifer had planned a pleasant 2-day journey from Phoenix to Denver for a family wedding, with an overnight stop in Santa Fe, where she had reservations at a comfortable mid-range hotel. As a nurse with years of road trip experience, she was comfortable with long-distance driving through mountainous terrain and changing weather conditions that characterize travel through the American Southwest. But construction delays and unexpected traffic had put her several hours behind schedule. By the time she reached the Santa Fe area, it was well past midnight and her reserved hotel room had been given to other guests due to her late arrival and the busy wedding season that had filled most accommodations in the popular tourist destination. After calling several hotels and finding no available rooms in Santa Fe or the surrounding area, Jennifer was forced to continue driving north toward Colorado, hoping to find lodging in one of the smaller towns along her route, before exhaustion made continued driving dangerous. The late hour and her fatigue made Jennifer less selective about accommodations than she would normally be. When she saw the familiar red roof and neon sign of a Motel 6 in a small New Mexico town, she decided to stop rather than risk falling asleep at the wheel during the challenging mountain driving that lay ahead. The Motel 6 was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty lots and desert scrubland that gave it an isolated feeling despite its proximity to the interstate highway. The building was typical single-story motel construction from the 1970s, with exterior corridors, individual room entrances, and basic amenities that budget travelers expected from the chain. The parking lot was mostly empty, with only a few cars scattered among the spaces, suggesting that the motel was not busy, despite the shortage of accommodations that Jennifer had encountered in Santa Fe. The desk clerk was a middle-aged man who seemed surprised to have a guest arrive so late at night. But he was helpful and accommodating, checking Jennifer in quickly and providing her with a key to room 23, which he described as one of their quieter rooms, located away from the highway noise and the ice machine. Jennifer was grateful for any available room and didn't pay much attention to the clerk's slightly apologetic tone when he handed her the key. Room 23 was located at the far end of the motel building, separated from the other occupied rooms by several empty units that gave Jennifer the privacy and quiet she needed for a good night's sleep. The room itself was clean and functional, with standard motel furnishings and working air conditioning that was important given the desert heat. Jennifer settled in quickly, unpacking her overnight bag and preparing for bed after the long day of driving and the stress of finding last-minute accommodations. She was tired enough that she expected to fall asleep immediately despite being in an unfamiliar place. But as Jennifer tried to fall asleep, she began to notice sounds that made her increasingly uncomfortable and suggested that her quiet room was not as isolated from other guests as the desk clerk had indicated. She could hear what sounded like conversations coming from the room next door, but the voices were muffled and indistinct, making it impossible to understand what was being discussed or even determine how many people were involved. The voices had a quality that suggested they were coming from people who were upset or agitated about something, with occasional raised voices and what sounded like arguments or disagreements that would escalate and then subside in patterns that suggested ongoing conflict or tension between the speakers. But as the night progressed, the conversations from the adjacent room became more disturbing and seemed to involve topics and language that made Jennifer increasingly concerned about the nature of the activities taking place next door. The voices would occasionally include what sounded like threats or discussions of violence, and there were sounds that suggested physical altercations or struggles that might indicate that someone was being harmed or held against their will. Subscribe and hit that like button if you've ever heard conversations through motel walls that made you question whether you should call the police, because what Jennifer discovered about the source of these voices challenged everything she thought she knew about who shares budget accommodations with ordinary travelers. Jennifer's nursing background had taught her to recognize signs of domestic violence and other dangerous situations, and the sounds from the adjacent room triggered her professional instincts to intervene or seek help for people who might be in danger. But the muffled nature of the sounds made it difficult to determine whether she was hearing actual violence or simply heated arguments between people who were not in immediate physical danger. Jennifer's attempts to determine the nature of the situation next door were complicated by the fact that when she looked out her window or stepped outside her room to investigate, she could see no signs of occupancy in the adjacent room. There were no cars parked in front of the room, no lights visible through the windows, and no other evidence that the room was occupied by guests. Who could be the source of the voices and sounds that were keeping her awake? The contradiction between the obvious sounds of multiple people engaged in heated conversations and the apparent emptiness of the adjacent room made Jennifer question whether she was experiencing some kind of acoustic illusion or whether the sounds were coming from a different location than she had initially assumed. She tried to trace the source of the voices by listening carefully and moving around her room, but the voices seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves rather than from any specific adjacent room or location. Jennifer's unease escalated when she realized that the conversation she was hearing included references to her own presence in the motel and discussions about her travel plans and personal information that she had not shared with anyone at the motel or during her journey. The voices would occasionally mention her license plate number, her destination in Denver, and other details about her trip that should not have been known to strangers or other motel guests. The realization that the mysterious voices somehow had access to her personal information and were discussing her presence at the motel filled Jennifer with a terror that went beyond simple concern about noisy neighbors or thin walls. She began to understand that she was not simply overhearing random guest conversations, but was somehow the subject of discussions by people whose identity and location she could not determine but who clearly had detailed knowledge of her activities and plans. Jennifer's attempts to investigate the source of the voices and determine who might be monitoring her activities were unsuccessful, as the sounds would stop whenever she tried to leave her room or make any noise that might indicate she was listening to the conversations. The voices seemed to be aware of her movements and would resume their discussions only when she was quiet and appeared to be trying to sleep or rest. The pattern of the voices starting and stopping in response to Jennifer's activities suggested that she was being watched or monitored by people who could observe her behavior and adjust their own activities accordingly. The realization that her privacy and security had been compromised in ways that she could not understand or defend against made Jennifer feel trapped and vulnerable in the motel room that was supposed to provide safety and rest during her journey. Jennifer's escape from the disturbing situation came when she decided to leave the motel in the middle of the night rather than remain in a room where her safety and privacy were clearly compromised by unknown individuals with access to her personal information and the ability to monitor her activities. She packed her belongings quickly and quietly, hoping to leave without alerting whoever was responsible for the mysterious voices and surveillance. When Jennifer checked out at the front desk, the same clerk who had checked her in seemed surprised by her early departure and asked if there had been any problems with her room or the motel's services. Jennifer mentioned the voices and sounds from the adjacent room, but the clerk insisted that the room next to hers had been vacant all night, and that there were no other guests in that section of the motel who could have been the source of the disturbances she described. The clerk's denial of any other guests in the area where Jennifer had heard the voices confirmed her suspicion that something unusual and potentially dangerous was happening at the motel, but it also made it clear that she would not receive any assistance or explanation from the motel staff. Jennifer left the motel without pursuing the matter further, choosing to drive through the night to reach Denver rather than risk another encounter with whatever forces had turned her overnight stay into a terrifying experience. But if you think mysterious voices discussing your personal information represent the worst thing that can happen in a budget motel, wait until you hear what Marcus experienced in Oklahoma. Because sometimes the harassment isn't coming from the room next door, it's coming from directly above you, and the people responsible have access to spaces that shouldn't exist, and knowledge of your presence that suggests surveillance capabilities that go far beyond simple criminal opportunism. Marcus was a traveling insurance adjuster investigating storm damage claims across Oklahoma and Texas during a particularly active tornado season that had generated hundreds of insurance claims requiring on-site investigation. He had been staying in budget motels for over a month as he traveled from town to town, assessing property damage and meeting with policyholders who had lost homes and businesses to severe weather. Marcus was experienced with budget motel accommodations and had stayed at dozens of Motel 6 locations throughout his career without experiencing any significant problems. He appreciated the chain's consistency and reliability, knowing that he could expect clean rooms, basic amenities, and reasonable rates that fit within his company's travel budget guidelines. On this particular trip, Marcus was staying at a Motel 6 in a small Oklahoma town that had been severely damaged by a tornado several weeks earlier, leaving many residents displaced and creating a shortage of available accommodations for insurance adjusters, contractors, and other professionals working on recovery efforts. Marcus had been fortunate to secure a room at the motel, which was one of the few lodging options in the area that had not been damaged by the storm. The motel was busier than usual due to the influx of recovery workers and displaced residents, but Marcus's room was comfortable and adequate for his needs during what he expected to be a week-long stay. Room 42 was located on the second floor of the two-story motel building with a view of the parking lot, and the damaged buildings beyond that served as a constant reminder of the tornado's destructive power. For the first few nights of his stay, Marcus's experience at the motel was routine and unremarkable, with the usual sounds and activities associated with a busy lodging facility serving a diverse mix of guests who were in the area for various storm-related purposes. Marcus established a routine of working during the day, returning to the motel in the evening to complete his reports, and getting adequate rest to maintain his energy for the demanding work of damage assessment. But on his fourth night at the motel, Marcus began to experience disturbances that challenged his understanding of motel operations and guest behavior. Marcus was awakened around 2 in the morning by sounds coming from the room directly above his, which appeared to be occupied by guests who were moving furniture or heavy objects around the room at an hour when such activities would normally be considered inappropriate and disruptive. The sounds from the room above were not typical guest noises like television, conversation, or normal movement. but seemed to involve the systematic rearrangement of furniture and the movement of heavy objects across the floor in patterns that suggested deliberate, organized activity rather than normal guest behavior. The sounds would continue for extended periods, stop abruptly, and then resume with different patterns and rhythms that suggested multiple people working together on some kind of project. Turn on those notifications if you've ever realized that the sounds above your hotel room were too systematic and purposeful to be explained by normal guest behavior, because what Marcus discovered about the apparent emptiness of the room above him proved that some motel harassment comes from sources that don't appear on any guest registry. Marcus's initial reaction was to assume that the guests above him were inconsiderate travelers who were unaware of how their activities were affecting other guests, and he considered calling the front desk to request that the motel staff address the noise problem. But as Marcus listened more carefully to the sounds from above, he began to realize that the activities were too systematic and purposeful to be explained by normal guest behavior or even inconsiderate conduct. The sounds from the room above included what appeared to be the movement of furniture, but the patterns and timing suggested that the furniture was being arranged and rearranged repeatedly in different configurations, as if the occupants were testing different layouts or searching for a specific arrangement that would serve some unknown purpose. The sounds also included what appeared to be the installation or removal of equipment or fixtures, with drilling, hammering, and other construction-related noises that were completely inappropriate for a motel room. Marcus is concerned about the unusual activities above his room escalated when he realized that the sounds were continuing throughout the night without any apparent breaks for sleep or rest, suggesting that the occupants of the room were engaged in activities that required sustained effort and attention rather than normal overnight guest behavior. The persistence and intensity of the activities also suggested that whatever was happening above his room was more important to the participants than maintaining good relations with other guests or following normal motel etiquette. Marcus's attempts to investigate the source of the disturbances by observing the motel's exterior and parking areas revealed information that made the situation even more puzzling and concerning. When Marcus looked out his window to see if there were vehicles or other evidence of the guests who were creating the disturbances above his room, he discovered that there were no cars parked in the spaces corresponding to the room above his, and there were no signs of occupancy or activity that would explain the sounds he was hearing throughout the night. The absence of vehicles or other evidence of guests in the room above Marcus suggested that either the occupants were using the room without registering as guests, or that the sounds were coming from a source other than normal guest activities. Marcus considered the possibility that the sounds might be coming from maintenance activities or building repairs being conducted during overnight hours to avoid disrupting guests during the day, but the nature and timing of the sounds did not match normal maintenance procedures. Marcus's investigation of the situation was complicated by the fact that when he tried to contact the front desk to inquire about the activities above his room, he found that the motel's phone system was not working properly and that there was no staff member available at the front desk during the overnight hours when the disturbances were occurring. The lack of available assistance from motel staff made it impossible for Marcus to get official information about what was happening above his room. The situation reached a crisis point when Marcus realized that the activities above his room were not random or purposeless, but seemed to be specifically designed to create disturbances that would affect his sleep and ability to rest during his stay at the motel. The timing and patterns of the sounds suggested that whoever was responsible for the activities was aware of Marcus's presence in the room below and was deliberately creating noise and disturbances that would make his stay uncomfortable and unpleasant. The realization that he was being specifically targeted for harassment by unknown individuals who had access to the room above his filled Marcus with a combination of anger and fear that made him question the security and management of the motel where he was staying. Marcus began to suspect that the motel staff might be aware of or even complicit in the activities that were disrupting his stay, particularly given the lack of available assistance and the apparent absence of normal security and guest services during the overnight hours. Marcus's escape from the disturbing situation came when he decided to change rooms rather than continue to endure the systematic harassment that was preventing him from getting adequate rest during his business trip. When Marcus approached the front desk the next morning to request a room change, the desk clerk seemed surprised by his report of overnight disturbances and insisted that the room above his had been vacant for several days and that there had been no maintenance or other activities scheduled in that area of the motel. The clerk's denial of any activities in the room above Marcus confirmed his suspicion that something unusual and potentially deliberate was happening at the motel, but it also made it clear that he would not receive satisfactory explanations or assistance from the motel staff. Marcus moved to a different room in another section of the motel, where he completed his stay without further incidents. But he remained convinced that his original room had been the target of deliberate harassment by individuals who had access to the motel's facilities and knowledge of guest assignments. But even systematic harassment from invisible occupants seems almost mundane compared to what Sarah experienced in Texas. Because sometimes the threat isn't coming from adjacent rooms or floors above. It's coming from inside your own room, testing your defenses, searching through your belongings, and waiting for you to make the one mistake that will give them access to everything you've tried to protect. Sarah was a college student driving from California to Florida to begin a summer internship, taking a southern route through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and other states that would allow her to see parts of the country she had never visited. She was traveling alone for the first time on such a long journey, and she had carefully planned her route and accommodations to ensure her safety and comfort during the multi-day drive. Sarah had budgeted for mid-range accommodations during her trip, but unexpected car repairs in Arizona had depleted her travel funds and forced her to seek more economical lodging options for the remainder of her journey. When Sarah reached a small Texas town after a long day of driving through desert heat and construction delays, she was grateful to find an available room at the local Motel 6. The Motel 6 was located on the main highway through town, surrounded by gas stations, fast food restaurants, and other businesses that served travelers and local residents in the rural Texas community. The motel building was older but appeared to be well-maintained, with a clean parking lot, working exterior lighting, and basic amenities that budget-conscious travelers expected from the chain. Sarah was assigned to room 18, which was located on the ground floor near the motel office, providing easy access to the front desk and a sense of security that was important to a young woman traveling alone. Room 18 was clean and functional, with standard motel furnishings and working air conditioning that was essential given the Texas heat. Sarah settled into the room quickly, unpacking her essentials and preparing for bed after the long day of driving. She was tired enough that she expected to fall asleep easily despite being in an unfamiliar place, and she felt secure in her room with the door locked and the chain engaged, following the safety practices that her parents had taught her for traveling alone. But as Sarah tried to fall asleep in the motel room, she began to experience disturbances that made her increasingly uncomfortable and suggested that her room might not be as secure and private as she had assumed when she checked in. Sarah was awakened by sounds that seemed to be coming from inside her room rather than from adjacent rooms or external sources, creating a situation that challenged her understanding of room security. The sounds included what appeared to be footsteps moving slowly across the room, but when Sarah turned on the lights to investigate, she found the room empty and undisturbed, with no evidence of any intruder or explanation for the sounds she had heard. The footsteps had a deliberate, measured quality that suggested someone walking carefully to avoid detection, but the absence of any visible presence in the room made Sarah question whether she had actually heard the sounds. Hit that subscribe button and share this with anyone who's traveled alone, because what Sarah discovered about the persistence and intelligence of her invisible intruder proved that some motel rooms come with occupants who don't need keys to gain access, and who know exactly when you're most vulnerable. Sarah's attempts to dismiss the sounds as imagination or building settling were unsuccessful, as the footsteps continued throughout the night whenever she tried to sleep, always stopping when she turned on the lights or made any movement that indicated she was awake and alert. The pattern of sounds, starting and stopping in response to Sarah's activities, suggested that whatever was causing them was aware of her presence and behavior, which was impossible if the sounds were simply building noises or acoustic illusions. The situation became more alarming when Sarah began to hear other sounds that suggested someone was moving around her room and handling her personal belongings while she was trying to sleep. She could hear what sounded like dresser drawers being opened and closed, the rustling of papers and clothing, and the soft sounds of someone searching through her luggage and personal items. But when Sarah turned on the lights to investigate these sounds, she found her belongings undisturbed and exactly as she had left them when she prepared for bed. The contradiction between the obvious sounds of someone searching through her room and the undisturbed condition of her belongings when she investigated made Sarah realize that she was experiencing something that went beyond normal security concerns or the possibility of an intruder in her room. The sounds were too specific and detailed to be explained by building noises or acoustic illusions, but the absence of any physical evidence of disturbance suggested that whatever was happening existed outside normal understanding of how intruders and room security worked. Sarah's fear escalated when she began to hear sounds that suggested someone was trying to enter her room through the door or windows, with the soft sounds of someone testing the locks, trying to manipulate the door handle, and attempting to find ways to gain access to her room without alerting her to their presence. But when Sarah checked the door and windows, she found them securely locked and undisturbed, with no evidence that anyone had attempted to tamper with the room's security features. The sounds of attempted entry continued throughout the night, creating a constant state of anxiety and alertness that made it impossible for Sarah to rest or sleep despite her exhaustion from the long day of driving. The persistence and variety of the sounds suggested that whoever or whatever was responsible for them was determined to gain access to her room and was testing multiple methods of entry to find a way past the security measures that were supposed to protect hotel guests. Sarah's attempts to contact the front desk for assistance were unsuccessful, as the motel's phone system appeared to be malfunctioning, and there was no response to her calls for help or security assistance. The lack of available help from motel staff made Sarah feel isolated and vulnerable, trapped in a room where her security was being systematically tested by unknown forces, while the people who were supposed to ensure her safety were unavailable or unresponsive. The situation reached a crisis point when Sarah realized that the sounds and disturbances were not random or purposeless, but seemed to be part of a systematic effort to wear down her resistance and force her to unlock her door or otherwise compromise her room's security. The timing and intensity of the sounds suggested that whoever was responsible for them was trying to create enough fear and exhaustion that Sarah would make mistakes or poor decisions that would give them access to her room and person. Sarah's escape from the terrifying situation came when she decided to leave the motel immediately rather than remain in a room where her safety was clearly compromised and where help was not available from the motel staff or security systems. Sarah packed her belongings quickly and quietly, hoping to leave without alerting whoever was responsible for the night-long harassment to her departure plans. She checked out at the front desk, where the clerk seemed surprised by her early departure, but offered no explanation for the problems she had experienced or assistance with her concerns about room security. Sarah drove through the night to reach the next major city on her route, where she found secure accommodations at a different motel chain, and was able to get the rest she needed before continuing her journey to Florida. These 3 accounts from Motel 6 locations across America reveal a disturbing truth about budget travel accommodations. The familiar chain motels we depend on for affordable, reliable lodging can become stages for encounters that challenge our understanding of guest safety and the security measures that are supposed to protect travelers during their most vulnerable moments. Jennifer's experience with mysterious voices and surveillance in New Mexico proved that some motel rooms come with invisible occupants who have access to guests' personal information and the ability to monitor their activities in ways that suggest surveillance capabilities far beyond normal criminal opportunism. Marcus's encounter with systematic harassment from unknown occupants in Oklahoma demonstrated that some budget accommodations harbor individuals who have access to spaces that don't appear on guest registries and who can conduct sustained harassment campaigns against specific guests while remaining completely invisible to motel staff and security systems. Sarah's night of terror with invisible intruders in Texas revealed that some motel rooms are equipped with threats that can test security measures, search through personal belongings, and systematically wear down guests' resistance without leaving any physical evidence of their activities or presence. The most chilling aspect of these accounts is not the individual incidents themselves. It's the realization that in each case, the victims were staying at familiar chain motels that they had used safely many times before, and that the threats they encountered were sophisticated, persistent, and specifically designed to exploit the vulnerability of travelers, who were far from home and dependent on the security and hospitality provided by strangers. Jennifer had no warning that her emergency overnight stop would put her under surveillance by forces that somehow had access to her personal travel information and the ability to monitor her activities from spaces that appeared to be empty. Marcus had no indication that his routine business accommodation would become the target of systematic harassment by individuals who could access motel facilities without appearing on guest registries or security systems. Sarah had no clue that her budget-conscious lodging choice would expose her to invisible threats that could test her room security, search through her belongings, and systematically attempt to wear down her resistance while remaining completely undetectable to motel staff and security systems. If you're currently planning budget travel accommodations, especially in unfamiliar areas or during times when you're traveling alone, if you've ever felt uncomfortable in a motel room or sensed that your privacy and security were being compromised, trust your instincts and take extra precautions to ensure your safety. Comment below if these stories have opened your eyes to dangers you never considered, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous situations develop in the places where we expect to find rest and safety. Drop a comment sharing your own motel experiences, because documenting these incidents might be the only way to understand the full scope of the threats that face travelers in budget accommodations. The next time you check into a budget motel, remember these stories and prioritize your safety over convenience or cost savings. Before you go, check out the playlist in the description for more true accommodation horror stories that will change how you see budget travel forever. Because in the end, the most terrifying realization isn't that these things happened, it's that they're still happening right now in motel rooms across the country, to travelers who have no idea that their overnight stay might become a nightmare that will change how they think about budget accommodations forever. Rest easy tonight, and remember, the next time you slide that key card into a motel room door, ask yourself if you're really the only one who has access to that space, or if you're about to share your most vulnerable hours with forces that don't need keys, don't appear on guest registries, and don't plan to let you leave unchanged by the experience. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of any journey is not the road, it's discovering that the place you chose for safety and rest has been waiting for someone exactly like you to check in.